And here we Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Samach in Masechet Zevachim. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So yesterday, we saw two apparently contradictory statements involving Rav. Rav said, on the one hand, if the altar, and we're talking about now the outer altar became damaged, all sacrifices that were slaughtered, whether it was before the damage or after the damage, if it's slaughtered and now it's damaged, the altar, they all become disqualified. Okay? Rav Gidal, in the name of Rav, said if the inner altar was removed, we may burn the Ketoret in its place. So essentially the altar is not necessary for the Ketoret. So that those two statements seem to be inconsistent because the first statement, excuse me, is that if the altar is damaged, is not there, you can't do a sacrifice. And if the second statement is if the inner altar is not there, you can still do the ketoret that is done on the inner altar. So in one place, the altar is not required, and namely inside the Kodesh, and then outside in the Azara, the altar seems to be required. So isn't this a contradiction? To address this apparent inconsistency, the Gemara cited an answer that Rava gave for Rabbi Yehuda in a different context, namely that sacrificial blood is different, as it requires that the blood be thrown only on the altar. So the outer altar has different rules, and Rav would agree. The outer altar is necessary when it comes to sacrifices that involve blood. The inner altar is not necessary when it comes to ketoret. So not necessarily inconsistent. Now, the Gemara then wondered where Rava gave this answer. So we spent the second half of yesterday discussing the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. And here are the key elements of that debate. Rabbi Yossi says that the surface of the outer altar in the Mishkan was 5 amot by 5 amot, and it was 10 amot high, with the curtains around the Mishkan 15 amot high, and the altar in the Beit HaMikdash could handle 142,000 sacrifices. So when Shlomo dedicated the Beit HaMikdash and they offered the 142,000 sacrifices, there was no need to sanctify the ground in the courtyard in order to burn olot on it. That wasn't what was happening. It was just sanctifying the ground, as we will see, to build the mikdash, to build the mishkan, to build the mizbeach on it. Excuse me. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, disagrees. He says that the outer altar in the Mishkan was 10 amot by 10 amot and 3 amot high, with the curtains around the Mishkan, and they were 5 amot high, not 15 amot high. They were only 5 amot high. And the altar in the Beit HaMikdash could not possibly handle 142,000 sacrifices, so the ground in the courtyard was sanctified so that olot could be burned on the ground. So that's the basics. Those are the basics of the disagreements between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. And as we pick up on the third line of Samach Amud Aleph, the Gemara has just explained that Rabbi Yossi says that the altar is 10 amot based on a Gzeira Shava between 10 amot tall, based on the Gzeira Shava between the inner and outer altars in the Mishkan, as they both have a height that is double the width of this top surface. Now the Gemara wonders what Rabbi Yehuda does with that Gzeira Shava. Now, in fact, we saw what he does with the Gzeira Shava because he doesn't make the Gzeira Shava between the inner altar and the outer altar. He makes the Gzeira Shava between the altar that was discussed in Yechezkel and the altar that is discussed in the Chumash. And he says that just as the one in Yechezkel, it's all the measurements are from the center, and therefore when it says that it's 12 amos, it means that it's really 24 by 24. So too here, when we say that it's that the altar is 5 amot, it's all measured from the center, and so as a result, the surface is 10 amot by 10 amot, as we have already mentioned. And so that's why I already noted that aspect of the disagreement. So let's take a look. The Rebbe Yehuda, third line down on Samach Amud Aleph. The Rebbe Yehuda, Ki Gamir Gzeira Shava Berechba Hu Gamir. When he used this Gzeira Shava, as we saw yesterday, he dealt with it for the width of the altar, meaning that both of them say Ravua, it's square, and so as a result, he says that just as that square is measured from the center, and so when we say 12 amos, we mean 24 by 24. So too, when we say 5 amot here, we mean 10 by 10. Ul Rabbi Yehuda hakam chazik kohen. But when second, one of the reasons that we saw yesterday that it had to be that the fence, the curtains around the entire Mishkan were 15 amot tall, or roughly 30 feet tall, was because the Kohen was standing on a 20-foot tall, a 10 amot tall platform, namely the Mizbeach, and doing work, and we didn't want him to be seen. So 5 amos is taller than a human being. Most human beings are on the order of 3 to 4 amos tall. And so, of course, then probably the amo were smaller, more like a foot and a half. So a little bit smaller than what most people are today. And there's a debate when we say that a person is 3 amos tall. Is that 3 amos to the shoulder or 3 amos to the top of the head? In any event, the bottom line is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, with the surface of the Mizbeach being 3 amos tall and the fence around it being only 5 amos tall, that means that you're going to have people being able to see in and see the Kohen on top of the altar because his head is going to be above the ledge, the top rim of the curtains. So yes, that's true. The Gemara answers, Nehi de Kohen mitchazi. Yeah, you're right. The Kohen will be able to be seen, but avodah de biyado lo mitchazi. But all of the work is being done below essentially the waist of the Kohen. That's where he's moving the sacrifice and onto the altar. And so as a result, that is not going to be visible because that's going to be below the edge of the curtains, which are 2 amos above the bottom of the top level of the altar. So Bishlama, the Rebbe Yehuda. So again, we still haven't gotten to the statement of Rava that we're waiting for. That's going to come in a few more minutes. Bishlama, the Rebbe Yehuda. So now everything works according to Rebbe Yehuda, who says that they sanctified the ground of the courtyard in order to burn sacrifices on it. Hainu diksiv kidesh. That's why in Sefer Melachim, Aleph, Pasuk, Perek Chet, Pasuk, Samech Dalid, it says that Shlomo sanctified the courtyard. But according to Ella, because he needed to sanctify the surface of the courtyard in order to burn the olot there. But Ella Rabbi Yossi. But according to Rabbi Yossi, my Kiddush, what does it mean that he sanctified the surface of the courtyard? So the answer is Lahamid Ba Mizbeach. He sanctified it in order to put the altar on it, to build the altar on it. So Bishlamo Rebbe Yossi Hainu Diksiv Katon. So 1 second, now I can go in the other direction and say, you know what? There's something about that same pasuk in Melachim Aleph Perek Chet Pasuk Samach Dalid, that it makes sense according to Rebbe Yossi. Because Rebbe Yossi, what does that pasuk say? Let's read the pasuk again, just as a reminder, right? The pasuk says, excuse me, the pasuk says, V'yizbach. No, that's not it. Where is the pasuk? Here it is. Bayom Hahu, on that day, Kidesh HaMelech es Tocha Chatzer, that the king sanctified the courtyard, Asher Lefnei Beis Hashem, that is before the house of Hashem. So that we're talking about the courtyard of the Beit Hamikdash. Ki asa sham es ha'olab, es ha'mincha, es chelvei hashlamim, ki mizbach ha'nechoshes asher lefnei Hashem katon me'achil es ha'olab, es ha'mincha, es chelvei hashlamim, because the copper altar was too small. So, according to Rebbe Yossi, it makes total sense. Hainu diksiv katon, right? The copper altar was too small. That's why the larger stone altar was made by King Shlomo, and so that all works. But Elul Rebbe Yehuda. But according to Rebbe Yehuda, my katon. What does it mean that it was too small? Because after all, even the new stone altar was too small because they needed to use the floor in order to burn the sacrifices. So Hachikamar, this is what it's saying. Mizbach Abanim Sh'asa Shlomo Tachas Mizbach HaNechoshes Katon Hava. That when we refer to the Mizbach HaNechoshes, we're not actually referring to the original Mizbeach on the time of Moshe. Rather, we're referring that the Mizbeach that was built in the Beit HaMikdash to replace the copper altar that was Moshe set up, that is what's too small. And so, as a result, if you take a look at Rashi, Hachi Kamar, so umishum dekai b'makom mizbeach hanechoshes, because it was established in the place of the copper altar, v'chilufohu, and it was in exchange for it, kari le mizbeach hanechoshes. It also gets called by that same name. Okay, so that we'll stop the Rashi there, and we'll go back into the Gemara. So, b'mai kamifliki. What?
Rabbi Huda?
No, we'll see. Rabbi Yehuda. Yes, Rabbi Yehuda is going to be next. So, b'mai kamifliki. So, b'mai pligi. Excuse me. That we're now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines down in the Gemara. But my pligi, what are they arguing about? Mar savar done in chutz mechutz. Rabbi Yehuda says that we are going to derive a lesson about the outer altar from the outer altar. Meaning, why was it that Rabbi Yehuda focuses on the Gzera Shava between the outer altar in the Chumash and the outer altar in Yechezkel, as opposed to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi instead focuses on a Gzera Shava between the outer altar and the inner altar. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, we say, done in chutz mechutz, we focus just on the outer altar because we're focusing on things that are outside the sanctuary, outside the heichal. The ain done in chutz mipnim, and we're not going to learn from something that was inside the heichal, namely the golden altar, to something that was outside. Umar Savar, whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, done in Kli Mikli. We learn one vessel from another, the ain done in Kli Mibinyan. And we don't learn a vessel from a physical built structure that was connected to the ground, because the altars that were in the time of the Mishkan, both of them were very movable. You could put in staves and you could move them, etc. And you had staves in them and you could move them as needed. Whereas the altar that we're talking about in the Beit Hamikdash, that was built to be connected to the ground and is not intended to be moved. And so as a result, because it's intended to stay on the ground and effectively be a physical ground attached structure, that's why Rabbi Yossi says we're not going to choose to learn from the Ravua that is mentioned, the squareness that is mentioned with respect to the Mizbeach in Sefer Yechezkel, but rather we'll use the Mizbeach HaZahav that was in the Mishkan. So that is why, and exactly what is when we say Kli Mikli, Rashi points out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi, Kli Mikli, Mizbeach HaNechoshes VaHazahav Kelim Heim. Both of them were movable vessels. And so that's exactly why Rabbi Yossi chooses to learn one from the other. And now, that we've
But
said
aren't we
all.
talking about Shlomo, the a time of Melech Shlomo, there was not enough space. Like that's a part of the discussion here for all the
Yes.
carbonate. So why so we're talking
Well,
about
it's a machlokas whether it was
I
not enough
understand.
space.
Oh, so that's our discussion. There was, there
Yep.
wasn't. So why is it? Why the question I have is why do we talk about a mizbeach in the time of Moshe? We're talking about what happened in the time of Shlomo. What is it? What's even the point of making a reference
Aha.
to?
Let me make that clear. So, the key element in determining whether there was enough space is understanding what was the nature of the Mizbeach that, that on which Shlomo, before building the Beis Hamikdash, so we're talking about, therefore, arguably, the Mizbeach of Moshe, that was apparently, at least according to some opinions, still around at that time. And as a result, how large was that mizbeach? And given the amount of korbanot that Shlomo offered on that mizbeach and the amount of space on the surface of that mizbeach, we can then determine whether or not it was possible to do 142,000 sacrifices on a space that is 20 by 20. According to Rebbe Yossi, the space that was available on the original altar, the outer altar, the copper altar, the altar that was in the outside of the in the courtyard of the Mishkan, only had one square amma on which one could burn a olot. And given that they burned 1,000 olot on that small space in one day, therefore they would be able to burn 400,000 olot in a 20 by 20 space. Well, 400,000 is more than 142,000, and that's why Rabbi Yossi says that they didn't need to burn any sacrifices on the floor of the Azara. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the original altar in the Mishkan, and that the altar that Shlomo HaMelech used to sacrifice 1,000 olot was not 5 amot, which by 5 amot, which left only 1 amma in order to to burn the sacrifices. It was 10 amot by 10 amot, and a 10 amma by 10 amma altar. It had 36 square amot, a 6 by 6 space that was capable of being used to burn olot. And now, if you put 36 in that 36 square amot, if you're capable of burning 1,000, well, then in 400 square amot, you're only going to be able to burn around 11 or 12,000, certainly not 142,000. And so as a result, that's why Rabbi Yehuda says they needed to use the floor. So the whole basis of whether or not they needed to use the floor is understanding the size of the original altar. So that's why we're talking about the original altar in the time of Moshe. Okay?
But
So,
don't we know? Don't Isn't that a fact? Don't we know which altar was there?
well,
I mean,
first
so
of
wasn't
all,
someone recording history? And if
there
Moses,
wasn't somebody recording history. We're going to see either today or tomorrow that in fact there's a debate about the issue of whether or not it was the same altar. We're going to see that very shortly. I think it's today. I can't remember now. And so that's point number one. And point number two is we don't even know, even though it explicitly says in the Torah that it's 5 amot, that it's explicit in the Torah, but something in the Torah is understood to be not like it's written. According to Rebbe Yehuda, it's the size of the surface of the altar, the size of the altar in width and length. That according to Rebbe Yehuda, when it says 5, it really means 10 by 10, not 5 by 5. And according to Rebbe Yossi, the aspect that is not literal in the Torah is reference to the height of the Mizbeach. According to Rabbi Yossi, the height of the Mizbeach, even though it says in the Torah that it's 3 amot high, it's really 10 amot high. So again, there's something that's going to be not literal. And the question is, that's the debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. So that it's important to understand that yes, you're exactly right. It is hard to believe that we actually have a debate about what the facts were, but the facts depend on how we understand a particular Gzeira Shava, and therefore that is going to determine what in fact, how we understand what in fact happened. And yes, we don't have perfect history because we didn't have the video cameras and stuff like that we have today. And of course, in a couple of years, we're already getting to a point where the video cameras don't matter because you can make it all up and it can look exactly like it was real. So we're actually going to be shortly getting back to an age where the whole what?
You got AI now.
Yeah, exactly. You have AI, and so as a result, with AI, we're going to end up in a place where everything is again. You can't necessarily go by any kind of evidence. You need the only a interaction, a personal interaction is necessary. No longer is a camera going to be sufficient. It'll be interesting to see when, from a halachic standpoint, we end up saying that because, can you put in, so anyways, this is an interesting question. But all right, we now got, so again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when we needed to sanctify the land in order to burn the olot. And it is now that we've said all of that, we probably could have done it in a shorter time frame if we would have just gone to the bottom line and said, look, Rabbi Yehuda says that the entire courtyard is sanctified. Now we have Rava's statement. Again, when Amar is the last word on the I think it's the 13th line, and then Rava is the first word on the 14th line, and we say, Amar Rava, Moda Rabbi Yehuda bedamim. Rabbi Yehuda admits that when it comes to blood, the sanctification of the floor of the Mizbeach was not, the floor of the courtyard of the Azara was not a sufficient sanctification that now you could put the blood on the floor instead. The Tanya, because and so let's take a look at Rashi, right? So Rashi explains exactly what I just said. Moda Rebbe Yehuda bedamim, 1, 2, 3, 7 lines up is where it says Moda Rebbe, and then 6 lines up in the narrow lines of Rashi, it says Yehuda bedamim. De'af al gaf the Amar Rebbe Yehuda kol ha'azara mikudeshes, that even though Shlomo sanctified the entire Azara, the entire courtyard, Hani mili lahaktir chalavim, that was in order to burn the fats. Aval lizurikas damim lo, but it was not in order to be able to sprinkle the blood. And how do I know that? Back into the Gemara. So Tanya, because we have a Baraisa. Now it's the second to last. Tanya is the second to last word on the 13th line. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kos Echad Hayam Male Midam Hatarovis. This is a reference to Pesach. They would fill 1 cup with blood of Pesach offerings that had mixed up. And what does it mean that they mixed up? Midam Hatarovis, Rashi tells us. Shel Psachim, this is the blood of Korban Pesach, Me'al HaRitzpah, from on top of the floor, because we are concerned, as we'll see in a moment, that maybe some blood fell and was never spilled on, never poured on the altar. V'shovcho al gabi mizbeach, and this mixed up blood, which we view, because it's a mixture of a liquid, we view as if all of the blood from all of the sources are all mixed into this one little container throughout the entire Azara, and it's all going to be there, and we then pour that on the altar. V'shovcho al gabi mizbeach she'im yishpach damo shalachaz mehem, because just in case some blood spilled, and now that sacrifice would be an invalid sacrifice because you never poured the blood on the altar, because so much was going on. There were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of sacrifices being made because every larger family needed its own sacrifice. So nimtza zeh machshiro. So as a result, this pouring would cause it to be kosher. Now, that's what the Brisa says. But if you think that when Shlomo sanctified the ground, that the ground itself could be like the Mizbeach, Sava Rebbe Yehuda, Kula Azara Mikadsha. This is Rebbe Yehuda talking. So if he says that the entire courtyard was sanctified, even for throwing blood, Ha is Avida Le Mitzvase, then you don't need to pick up the blood from the ground and put it on the altar. It already went on something that was sanctified. So that's the proof that Rava offers. Now, it's not necessarily a definitive proof because Vidilma Mishum de Kasavar Shvicha Mikol Ha'adam Be'inan. Maybe what you need is you need a physical throwing of the blood onto the altar and that there be some personal force that the human being conveys. But if it's just spilled, then it doesn't necessarily have any force from the human being. So as a result, maybe that's why it's not good. No, well, all right, but if that were sufficient, then you could pick up the blood and pour it and throw it right back down on its original place. You don't need to go to the Mizbeach and create risk that more blood is going to spill and never be poured onto the Mizbeach. The doma mishum de be'inan mitzvah min muchar. But again, it gets deflected. It's not a definitive proof. Nonetheless, again, it's Rava's answer. So, but there's no definitive proof to it because he says, the Gemara points out, maybe we hold that you want to do it the best way. And you're right that it would have been sufficient on the ritzpah, on the floor. But we don't want to pour the blood on the floor. We want to pour the blood on the Mizbeach. And so as a result, that's why we're going to do it in the best way. And when we have the opportunity to do things in the best way, that's what we should do. All right. So again, but this was the statement of Rava that we quoted yesterday, and we were trying to find where was that source. This is the source. And even though in the end there's no definitive proof that that statement is correct with respect to Rabbi Yehuda, the bottom line is that we can make that statement with respect to Rav. That Rav says that what's the difference between the golden altar and the outer altar? It's the fact that the outer altar requires that the blood actually be put on it, and it's not sufficient to go anywhere else. Go ahead. Question.
So I'm just a little confused here, but it seems that pouring the blood, if the blood were to fall on the ground, it would be okay. But Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's not. Floor is not sanctified, right?
No. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that the floor is sanctified. Rabbi Yossi says the floor is not sanctified. Rabbi Yossi is the one who said that the
no, it's not. But it's not for the blood, not sanctified for blood.
Correct. It's not sanctified for blood. That's what Rava says about Rabbi Yehuda, and he says it based on the brisa about Pesach. And so as a result, what we've done is we've said your proof is not necessarily a good proof. He can still make the statement, and maybe Rabbi Yehuda actually does believe that the blood, that the floor of the courtyard was not sanctified for blood, but we no longer have a proof for that fact.
Because the blood spilled on the floor during the Pesach.
Correct, right? And maybe that's good enough. And the only reason that we say that it's not good enough is because we want to do things the best way. And so really, bidi avad.
So bidi avad, it would be okay, right? According to Rabbi Yehuda.
It possibly. That's what the Gemara comes to the conclusion that you can't prove Rava's statement. The fact of whether Rava still believes in the statement, even if we can't prove it, but the point is we don't have a definitive proof. Okay, so that's the understanding of that brisa. The brisa, you can understand the brisa as saying that this is even b'diavad, it needs to be done, and as a result, that's what it's talking about. Or maybe that brisa is only lechatchila, and b'diavad you would be okay because Rabbi Yehuda says that the floor has been sanctified. We don't know which way to read that brisa. And so clearly, Rava reads that brisa as even b'diavad, that you need to do this, and otherwise it's not going to be good for that person, whoever it was that whose Kohen spilled the blood accidentally. And the other way of reading it that the Gemara presents is no. In the end, if he didn't do it, it's going to be okay, because bottom line is that the entire ritzpah was sanctified. But we need to do, and of course that assumes that the person poured it back out, right? Again, the question is whether we need the force of a person. If we do need the force of a person, then you still need to pick it up, but you at least need to pour it back on the location. So if in fact a person were to have picked it up and poured it back, that would be the debate between would that be okay or would that not be okay? So
When you say did it, what do you mean by it? If he did it.
if he poured the blood, if he spilled the blood spilled, and now he picked it up and he spilled it back right on that same location, but now he did it intentionally. So there's the force of human activity. So the debate between how Rava reads this brisa and how the Gemara presents as an alternative to read the brisa, according to the alternative, if you purposely picked up the blood and poured it back down on that same spot, and then b'diavad, according to Rabbi Yehuda, maybe it would be good, and that would disagree with Rava. Or
Right.
according to Rava, no. When it says that it's sanctified, it was only with respect to burning of the sacrifices and
Right.
not with respect to blood, and therefore it would not be good, and therefore you need to go directly to the mizbeach. But we don't know which
Yeah.
way to
It
read
would be
that
possible
brisa.
if the blood fall on that second thought. If the blood falls on the floor, it's possible blood. You can't use it then, right?
No, no. We saw early on that if blood falls on the floor, you collect it right away and you
Huh.
then go back onto the process. As long as you originally caught it as you were supposed to.
But if you consider the floor not sanctified, then the
No,
blood.
no. Even if according to Rebbe Yossi, everybody agrees that if you caught the blood in the Kli Sharet, and now you're walking to the Kohen is walking to the Mizbeach and it spills out, you quickly collect whatever blood you can from the floor and continue on your process on your way to put that blood on the Mizbeach. Okay.
Okay. Even
Okay.
if it's
So all
not
right. So
sanctified, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if you would hold it's not sanctified.
even according to whether according to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yossi, doesn't make a difference. You're going to say that you collect that blood. All right. So Amar Rabbi Lazar. So now the Gemara discusses another law that applies when the altar is damaged. So Amar Rabbi Lazar, mizbach shenifgam ein ochlam begino shiare mincha. That we're not going to eat. That if the mizbeach is damaged, we are not going to eat as a result of that being damaged, as a result of the altar being damaged, we're not going to eat from it leftover mincha, meaning the mincha that we're supposed to eat, because some of it gets burned on the altar. What doesn't get taken to be burned on the altar is edible for the Kohanim. Shneamar v'ichalua matzot eitzel hamizbeach, because you're supposed to take the mincha. This is a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud pasuk Yud Bet, and eat it. It says Eitzel HaMizbeach, next to the Mizbeach. But did they really eat it next to the Mizbeach? No, of course not. They ate it anywhere in the courtyard, as Rashi explains. Ela Bisman Shehu Shalem. But what it's teaching us is that when the mincha is offered, it is that we can eat it only when the altar is there and is fully operational. So Ashkechan Shiare Mincha. This shows us that the leftovers of the Mincha also need to be cannot be eaten if the altar is problematic. Kodshe Kodshim Minalan. How do I know that this is true with respect to the rest of the Kodshe Kodshim sacrifices? Talmud Lomar, Kodesh Kodashim. Well, we have a Gzeira Shava because it says Kodesh Kodashim in connection with the Mincha and connection with all the other Kodesh Kodashim sacrifices. Kodshim Kalim Minayan. Okay, well, what about Kodshim Kalim? How do I know about that? Amar Abaye, Asya Midrasha de Rebbe Yossi. No, well, we can learn it from a lesson that Rebbe Yossi taught us. To Tanya, because we have a brisa, Rabbi Yossi Omer Gimel Dvarim Mishum. As we turn to Samach Bet Gimel Zikanim, we have a teaching that Rabbi Yossi taught in the name of three different elders, meaning he had three different teachings, three different elders. One was Rabbi Yishmael, one was Rabbi Akiva, and one was Ben Azai. But we're not, the only one that we're going to quote now is the one by Rabbi Yishmael. So v'zeh echad mehen. Here's one of them. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Yachol Ya'aleh Adam Maser Sheni Yerushalayim v'yoch lenu bizman hazeh. I might have thought that when we take Meiser Sheni today, we should go and bring it to the Yerushalayim and eat it there, even though, the temple is now destroyed. Vidinhu, and indeed, you can have a logical, but there's a logical argument to say that this is a mistake. Because Bechor Ton Habas Makom, Bechor requires being brought to a specific place, namely to Yerushalayim. Umaser ta'un havas makum, and Meiser Sheni also needs to be brought to a certain place, namely Yerushalayim. Ma bechor einu ela bifnei habayis. So just as bechor is only done when the Beis Hamikdash stands, we have to be very, very careful to try not to have any bechor animals today. We often deal with this by having non-Jewish partners own the mother before she gives birth. Av maaser enu ela b'fnei habayis. So too, Meiser Sheni is only going to be when the temple stands. So, one second though, Ma'ale bechor shekain ta'on matan damim ve'imurim legabi mizbeach. But a bechor is a sacrifice, meaning the animal needs to be sacrificed, and you give the animal to the Kohen, and the Kohen offers it as a sacrifice, and some of the blood and some of the and its sacrificial parts get put onto the mizbeach. That isn't true in connection with Meiser Sheni. But bikurim yochichu. All right, so let's instead use bikurim. So once and say, okay, let's learn from Meiser Sheni to Bikurim, or from Bikurim to Meiser Sheni. That just as Bikurim we don't do today because the Beis Hamikdash is not standing, so too we don't do Meiser Sheni. One second though, you can't do it just from Bikurim. Mala Bikurim shekain to unim hanacha. But Bikurim needs to put, you need to put the fruit and vegetables in front of the first items, those first growths. You need to put them in front of the altar. And again, Meiser Sheni doesn't require that. So as a result, that's how you can't learn it from Bikurim. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, so why don't we learn it from a combination of Bikurim and Bechor? The Gemara does not go there. We are going to ask very shortly why the Gemara didn't go there, but the bottom line is the Gemara doesn't go there and try and learn from both of them, and try from a Mamatzinu. Or Tzad HaShaveh, excuse me. They don't try to figure out what a Tzad HaShaveh is, and instead they go straight to Talmud Lomar, Ve'hevesem Shama Olosechem. No, we can learn it from a pasuk, because the pasuk says, and it's key to note that this pasuk references several different items. Vehevesem shama olosechem, you bring to the Yerushalayim your korban olot. Zivchechem, your other sacrifices. Ve'es masrosechem, your meiser sheni. Ve'es trumas yadchem, and the truma from your hand. V'nidrechem, and any oaths that you made. V'nidvosechem, swearing that you did. V'choros, and the firstborn, b'karchem v'tzonchem, of your cattle and your sheep. And so the point is that we have in this one pasuk, and the korban, the tithes, the namely the Meiser Sheni, and we have that same, and we have the firstborn flocks. So makish maser libechor. So as a result, we have a direct connection, a direct hekesh from Bechor to Meiser. So Ma Bechor Einu Ela B'fnei Habayis. So just as Bechor is only offered when the Beis Hamikdash is standing, Af Meiser Einu Ela B'fnei Habayis. So too, Meiser Sheni is only eaten in Yerushalayim when the Beis Hamikdash is standing. So now we get to the question that I mentioned. We maybe in most Gemaras, you would have thought that they would try to learn from a combination of Bikurim and Bechor. Why didn't we do that? And so the Gemara answers, Bishum de'ikal mifrach. Nah, there would have been an answer, a response that we could have given. Mala hatzad hashava shebehen, shekain yesh behen tzad mizbeach. That both the Bechor and the Bikurim, both of them need the Mizbeach. One needs the Mizbeach in order to sacrifice, to put the blood on it, and to burn the Imurim on it. And one of them needs the Mizbeach in order to put the fruit and vegetables right before it and put it next to it. So as a result, they both need the altar. That isn't true by Meiser Sheni, and so as a result, we knew right away that the Tzad Hashava Shebehen would not, that the Tzad Hashava would not work for to try and learn about Meiser Sheni from a combination of Bechor and Bikurim. So as a result, those fruit and vegetables then go to the Kohanim, if I remember correctly. Okay, so my Kasavar. So what does Rabbi Yishmael hold? Now, what does that mean? What is that? So my Kasavar, let's take a look at Rashi. It helps us out understand. So ninth line down in the narrow lines of Rashi on Samach Amabet. My Kasavar, Hai Tana, de Pashat Le, Bechor Maaser. That when we learn, when the fact that we learn Bechor from Maaser, I'm sorry, excuse me. That's although that's what Rashi says, the key point is that there's a little yud that takes you to the Shita Mikubetzes. And really what it's supposed to say, Hai Tana de Pashatle Bechor Tfei Mimaser. That what is the thinking of the Tana, namely Rabbi Yishmael, who says that it makes more sense to say that the Bechor is going to be something that you need the Beis Hamikdash for, more so than Meiser Sheni is something that you need to make the Beis Hamikdash. Because listen to the following. The question that we're now going to be discussing is the sanctification of the Beis Hamikdash. According to Rabbi Yishmael, it's clear that the sanctification of Israel, when it was done originally, it was done for all time. And so as a result, what we have as Meiser Sheni is Meiser Sheni today, meaning that there is an obligation to take Meiser Sheni. Now, once we have that obligation, the question is what can we bring it to anywhere? And so the question that's being asked is, does Yerushalayim, does the Temple Mount, does the Beis Hamikdash still have the holiness associated with the Beis Hamikdash, such that we could say that if we bring the Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, or we bring the Bechor to Yerushalayim, that we can still deal with it? Maybe not as a sacrifice when it comes to the Bechor, or maybe what happens if we actually already put the blood of that sacrifice on the Mizbeach, and we already burnt the emurim of it. And so now all that's left is the food of the sacrifice of the Bechor. And now the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. And so do we say that as a result of the destruction of the altar, we can no longer eat this Bechor or not? And so maybe this is a question about how we understand the holiness, the ongoing holiness of Yerushalayim. So, Ikasavar Kedusha Rishona, that the holiness of the Beis Hamikdash, when it became holy initially, Kitchel Shaisa Kitchel Asid Lavo, it was for that time and for all future times. Afilu Bechor Nami. Well, then we should have even the Bechor should be able to be eaten in Yerushalayim, and Rashi qualifies this by saying, yeah, we're talking about where the sacrifice was done already. It was slaughtered before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and the blood was put on the altar before the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and the emurim were burned on the altar before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But now that we have the food and we're ready to sit down to eat, the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, and the question is, okay, well, this day when we're trying to eat the Bechor, do we have, can we still eat it even though the Beis Hamikdash is now destroyed, or and specifically the altar is now destroyed? V'ika sabar lo kitchelas lavo. And if you tell me that actually the base site of the Beis Hamikdash was not sanctified even for the future, so then afilu b'chor nami tiboy, you should have a question not only about the Meiser Sheni, but you should have an equal question about the Bechor. Meaning, why was it that Rabbi Yishmael could make the assumption that the Bechor needs the Beis Hamikdash in order to be edible. So Amar Ravina la'olam kasavar lo kitcha. Really, Rabbi Yishmael says that the whole sanctification of the Beis Hamikdash did not sanctify the Beis Hamikdash for all time. And here's the case. The blood was offered before, the blood was applied before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And the burning of the emurim was done before the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and the meat's still around. And so we now make a hekesh between the meat and the blood. So just as the blood requires the altar, so too the meat requires the altar. And so that's the basis of Rabbi Yishmael saying, hey, that's how I know that in fact Bechor is not going to be able to be eaten when the Mizbeach is destroyed. And therefore I can learn from the Asi, Maaser, V'Yalav Mi Bechor. And then we go to Meiser Sheni and we learn that lesson from Bechor. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, 1 second, isn't that a Hekesh and then another Hekesh? Great question. But 1 second, we're talking about Korbanot. Korbanot is Kodshim. Kodshim says you can't do one Hekesh and then another Hekesh. Meiser Dagon Chulinhu. No, Meiser Sheni is not considered Kodshim. And so as a result, when we learn the second step of the Bechor to Meiser Sheni, totally legitimate. We can do that second step because that second step is a step towards Chulin. So Amar Basar Lamad Azlina. That works according to the opinion that whether or not the second step is considered Chulin or Kachim is based on the subject that you learn too. But what about according to the authority that focuses on the subject that you learn from? And now you're learning originally from blood of Bechor in case number in Hekesh number 1, and in Hekesh number 2 you're learning from the meat of the Bechor, and so those are two Kodshim. So how can you Ma'ikalamemer? What is there to say? So Dam Uvasar Chadam Milsahi. So the answer is that we said that we learned from the blood to the meat of the Bechor, and that we were doing that with a Hekesh, but really it's not a Hekesh. Really, it's one topic. That when we say that you need the Mizbeach for the blood, we're saying at the same time that you need the Mizbeach for the meat. And so as a result, this is really just one Hekesh. It's just a Hekesh, a single Hekesh from Bechor to the to Meiser Sheni. So we have now gotten to the place, I'm sorry for not scrolling. So while Abaye learned that all Kachim Kalim may not be eaten when the altar is not fit for use, it turns out that that is not a universal viewpoint. And we're going to hear what Rabbi Yirmiyah says about that viewpoint. But for that, you're going to need to stay tuned for tomorrow's daf, and looking forward to continuing our.
I mean, what would be the Havamina? So that would suggest perhaps that today someone could bring a Bechor to the Beit HaMikdash and shecht it there? Or, I mean,
no, in the end, we're saying.
In the end, but according to the Havamina, that one would not need a Mizbeach. You could today, one could bring the. According to that, the
Havamina is focused on a very narrow situation because you still need to have done the blood and the emurim. So the narrow situation that could have been valid is on the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. If you had already done the blood and burned the emurim, could you continue to eat that Bechor? That's the one case where we would say, if we say yes, then you can still eat it. But in the end, we say that that's not the case, and so as a result, even in that narrow
Oh,
situation, we say. But the Hava Amina is not. Oh, even today we could bring it. No, the Hava Amina. You might then say, if we said that you could bring and that you could eat the bechor in that narrow case, you would then also say that you could eat the Meiser Sheni today in Yerushalayim. That would be valid. But the eating of the Bechor is in the very, very narrow situation where the blood has been put already on the altar and the Emurim have been burned on the altar, and now the Beis HaMikdash gets destroyed and the Bechor meat is still around. Are you able to eat it?
so if they could freeze it, let's say, freeze dry it and hold it for 4,000 years or whatever,
So,
then maybe one could, right? I mean,
well, no, because right. So back to the fifth parak, right? We say uh, that the Bechor, right? And I just got
oh,
out
it
my
has to be eaten
siddur,
in one
right?
day, I think.
Exactly. The
Right,
Bechor, Necha l'kohanim,
right, right,
v'maaser l'kol adam,
right,
v'nechelam b'kol ha'ir, v'kol
right,
ma'achal, l'shnei yamim, v'layla
right,
echad. So the
right.
Bechor is only able to be eaten for 2 days. So even if you froze it, you would not be able to eat it any longer. Now it would be no sar. That would be very bad. So the point is that it's literally a 2 day question on the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed and the following day. That's the only 2 days in the entire universe's existence that this question exists. Right, I guess 4 days because their Beis Hamikdash got destroyed twice. So there are 4 days when this question sort of had application. But the bottom line is that in the end we say that no, he would not be able to eat it, and therefore that's why in fact today we don't actually bring our Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim. That's why there's a whole process of those who are in Israel that they set it aside and they let it rot and then they deal with it, etc. That
Well, you
etc.
can poda this on a coin, then you destroy the coin.
Correct, exactly. And then 100%. There's like I said, there's a whole process that you need to do. You're right, 100% right that what we do is we end up doing the redemption. Correct.
I just want to ask one quick question again
Please.
about this uh, topic with Rabbi Yehuda and the blood, that he does not agree that the floor of the Beit HaMikdash is sanctified for blood.
That's okay. Again, it's important to note that's Rava's
Rub's interpretation.
statement about it and Rava's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda. Go ahead.
So what is the what was the, and maybe it wasn't clear to me for a moment, what is the again the difference between the B'diavad and the Hatchila according to Rava's interpretation of
So
how Rabbi
according to
Yehuda could use
Rava's
it?
interpretation, you absolutely, if any blood of the Pesach fell, it's not even sufficient to pick up the blood and throw it back down on the location. You need to pick it up and you need to move it to the altar. You have to put it on the altar. And if you don't do that, according to Rabbah, it's totally invalid because although the floor of the Azarah was sanctified, it was not sanctified for the sprinkling of blood. And therefore, the spilling of blood cannot possibly, even if there was human force involved, even if there was intention involved, it cannot possibly satisfy the requirement to put the blood on the Mizbeach.
What would he do with
That's
it?
what Rabbah says.
What would he
Now,
do with it?
and
What
he
would
tries to prove it from the brisa about the Korban Pesach. And what we come to the conclusion is that Rava may still hold that, but the proof doesn't necessarily work.
But aren't we saying that you can pick up the blood and put it back? If everyone
So
holds that
if
it
in
spills?
fact, if in fact you reject the proof, if
Oh,
in fact you reject the proof that Rava brings and say, well, it doesn't have to be that, the alternative read of that
right.
brisa is to say that if you did pick it up, even though it would be the best thing to sprinkle it on the sprinkle that blood on the altar. If you then immediately turned it over and intentionally put it on the ground, thinking to yourself, well, the ground has been sanctified, so it's sufficient for me to put it on the ground with force in order to satisfy the obligation to sprinkle the blood. According to that, then b'di'avad, that would be good.
Why would you put it on the ground? For would you?
Why? Because maybe you don't want to walk all the way to the altar.
So,
The point is
oh,
that
you're spilling on the ground as if it's like an altar? Is that
as
the,
if it's like the altar. Correct, correct,
so where are
exactly.
you
That would be
sprinkling it? You're just throwing
what?
it on the ground and seven
Yeah, yeah,
times
you
or
throw it on the ground. That's exactly
seven
right.
times, six, whatever it is, the
Well,
number?
one the only I think it's I think the
What?
Pesach only requires one application.
Oh, so you just sprinkle it on the ground.
Correct.
And you still have to pick it up and sprinkle it on the ground, or you leave it on the ground?
Well, that was the first response as to why it wouldn't be a good proof is to say, well, maybe you need human force.
Uh-huh.
So the answer was, okay, fine, you need human force. So let him pick it up and put it right back down there. And then the answer to that was, well, maybe we want to try and have the person do it in a nice way. And the nice way is to put it on the Mizbeach. And so as a result, it's not a definitive proof that it doesn't work. It's only, and as a result, because it's not a definitive proof that it doesn't work, you can't necessarily say, like Rava says, that this is proof that Rabbi Yehuda says that the ground is not sanctified for blood. Maybe it is sanctified for blood. He just thinks, don't do it if you don't have to. And so, if in fact it is sanctified for blood, again, this is the alternative view to Rava, then if you were to pick it up and purposely put it back on the ground, well, then it would be b'diavad okay.
But didn't we say that everyone says you can pick up the blood if it spills?
Everybody says you can pick up the blood. The question is where do you then need to put the blood? So Rebbe
Uh-huh.
Yehuda, who says the entire floor was sanctified, would say that although it would be best to take it to the mizbeach, if you put it on the floor, because the floor was sanctified even for blood, according to this alternative read, right, that rejects the proof that Rava is trying to make. According to this alternative read, it's sanctified even for blood. So fine. So if you put it right back down on that same spot, so it'll be fine because it was sanctified even for blood. That's the debate. That's the question, right? Whether or not we can use this as a proof. And the answer is we can't use it as a
But
definitive proof.
didn't Rob want to use Rava? Didn't want it. Rava didn't he want to prove that Rebbe Yehuda did not agree that the floor of the Beit HaMikdash was sanctified for blood?
Rava's position is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the sanctification of the floor was only for burning and
Right,
not for blood.
right,
Only for burning and not for blood. And he tries to use a brisa that was said by Rabbi Yehuda to prove his case.
right.
And although there's a read of that brisa that certainly supports Rava, what we came to the conclusion is that's not the only read of that brisa.
So the
Yes,
alternative read is not Rava's; it's somebody else's.
yes, exactly. Is the response to Rava. It's
Uh-huh.
Rava, you tried to prove from this that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the floor was only sanctified for burning and not for blood. But I don't think that's a good proof. I think that you can read that maybe Rabbi Yehuda says even for blood it was sanctified. And yes, you're right that you have to pick it up and move it to the altar, but that's because that's what you need to do lichatchila. That's the best way.
Who's reading it that way? Is that the
That's
Gemara?
the Gemara itself is
Uh-huh.
offering that contradictory read in an effort to upslug
Right.
Rava and to say that his proof is not valid.
So we don't have a name of a Rav of
No, we
Rebbe.
don't have a name. We don't have a name. There
Okay,
was
all right.
nobody was specifically quoted. It's the Gemara itself trying to say that's not necessarily a valid.
Tzuba the Rabbanan, the Bachra
Exactly.
Yeshiva, the Bachra Yeshiva, whatever.
Exactly.
Okay, all right,
Exactly.
all right.
All right. Have a great day. Looking forward to continuing our learning tomorrow. Again, tomorrow only on Zoom. Be well.
Okay, very good.